We're going to be in Luke chapter 5. If you have, or if you don't have a Bible with you, we actually have Bibles that are right there. It should be in the chairs in front of you. There's a little rack underneath the chairs. You can grab one of those Bibles, and we're going to be on page 509. No, we're not. We're going to be on page 809. It is 809. I wrote it down. So if you don't have a Bible, look there. Everyone else, you can just turn to Luke chapter 5, verse 33. And we're going to read this passage. It's a little bit of an extended passage. We have 3 stories we're going to be talking through. And these 3 stories are actually in the middle of the context of 8 different interactions. And so as you're turning to Luke chapter 5, I'm just going to give you a quick flyover view of those 8 interactions, okay? So you kind of know where we're at with this. So here's where we're at. If we started over at the beginning of Luke chapter 5, we would open up there and we would hear about a miracle and Jesus calling 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John. Now, if you were here last week, you probably remember that, okay? Because that was from last week. And then we have 2 stories after that. And the stories are about healing. Jesus has healed some people. The first one was a leper who Jesus reached out. Do you remember it from last week? What did he do? Touched him. And he healed him. And the second one, they were in a house and they started to take off the roof tiles. You remember that? And they lowered a paralyzed man. And what did Jesus do with both of them? He healed them. And that's the next story. Then Jesus calls a man named Levi, who was a tax collector, to be a follower of him. Now, how many of you know the other name that we call Levi? We typically call him by a different name. What is that one? Okay, Matthew. Good. You're with me. Perfect. So Matthew, and he calls him. Now, what happens when this person who was a tax collector and greedy for money, what happens when Jesus comes into his life? Well, they celebrate. There's rejoicing. And the religious people that day are like, I'm not sure about this. You're spending way too much time eating and drinking and enjoying life with sinners. That's not appropriate. That was last week. Well, then we come to this week's passage. We're here in Luke chapter 5, verse 33. And this week we're going to see a couple things. We're going to see a question about fasting. We're then going to hear some accusations about the Sabbath. Those accusations don't stay for just 1 week. They continue on. We come to another Sabbath, and we find that Jesus heals a person. And then next week, Luke chapter 6, 12 through 16, we find that Jesus calls his disciples. And so that's the overall picture of what's happening in these pages. We're going to see Jesus performing miracles, Jesus proclaiming his deity, Jesus calling disciples, and some people getting really, really mad. With that in mind, let's read our passage together. Luke chapter 5, starting in verse 33. How we do it here, just an FYI, once I'm done reading, I'm going to say this is the word of the Lord, because we're really glad we get to hear from God. And so we just say that as a tradition here. We say, this is the word of the Lord, and then all will say together, me and you will say, thanks be to God. So you can be ready for that. Luke chapter 5, verse 33. And they said to him, the disciples of John fast often and offer prayers, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink. And Jesus said to them, can you make wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. He also told them a parable. No one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does, he'll tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one after drinking old wine desires new, for he says, the old is good. Luke 6. On a Sabbath, while he, Jesus, was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath? And Jesus answered them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those with him. And he said to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And a man was there whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. But he knew their thoughts. And he said to the man with the withered hand, come, stand here. And he rose and he stood there. And Jesus said to them, I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it? And after looking around at them all, he said to them, stretch out your hand. And he did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, many of you already know my wife, Christy. If you don't know her, get to know her. I think she's amazing, and I think you might think she's amazing too. One of the things that you might not know about her, though, is that she's a teacher. Okay, she has a lot of amazing things she does, but one of the things is she's a teacher. And she's taught all kinds of places. She's taught in public school and private school, and she's taught a couple different grades. But most often, all of her teaching has been early and elementary education. How many of you here are teachers? A handful? Okay. I don't know what you really love about teaching, but my wife loves to help these young kids learn how to read and learn how to love reading. She sees that as really important to helping them grow. And when you look at books for little kids, maybe you can think of some. Think of like some that you loved as a child, some that maybe you read or like really overread as a child. Or maybe you're thinking of some that you have overread to your own kids. Okay, that book that is falling apart and you've almost memorized it because you have read that book to death. What is a part of that book? As we think about it, normally small children, we're trying to teach them to understand who are the characters. What's the setting? What's the beginning, the middle, the end? Those pieces. There's a predictable pattern to the story. And for those teachers and for those kids, understanding those pieces are really important, right? Understand those stories are important. But at some point we step beyond that and we understand more complex matters. We want to understand cause. We want to understand effect. We want to understand the varying different viewpoints. We ask questions like, ooh, what was that person's motive? Right? You know what I'm talking about when we read books, read good literature. Well, it would be possible for us today, having read this passage, to really just look at it on a basic level and to see a beginning, a middle, and end, to see the characters, and to move on. But that's not the point. It's not just for us to observe the key elements of the story, but it needs to have a deeper impact on our lives. We need to engage with the story. There's something that we really need to learn from this passage about Jesus. Now, my wife is an awesome teacher, but Jesus is a master teacher. He is top of the top as a teacher. And if you know much about how Jesus interacted on his time here on earth, I think you'd agree with me. Even in our passage that we read today, did you notice how skillful he is in his interaction and in his teaching? Did you notice that even in his response, he's instructing? The parables he gives are meant to explain. Even the way he answers the question and his own explanation. Think about the timing of what he's doing. All of it is intended to teach. And who was he teaching in this story? Well, he's teaching the religious experts. That's obvious. We saw that, right? He's teaching his disciples. They're there. They're present. He's teaching all the bystanders, but he's also teaching us. So with that in mind, what is this story all about? What should we be looking for? What's going on here? These stories are intended to teach us about hearts. We need to understand hearts. What really are the desires and the motives behind these conversations, behind these questions, behind these actions? What is really going on? We're not expected to just kind of like bounce across the top of the details with the story, but go deeper and ask questions that will expose the heart of every single person involved. We want to understand the heart of the Pharisees. We want to understand the heart of Jesus. We want to understand our own heart as well. You see, we could ask the question, why do you do what you do? Of the different people in this passage. And as we do that, we're really going to understand the heart of the matter, what's really going on, okay? So that's our goal today. Let's ask that question. What's going on? Why do you do what you do, all right? So let's hop in. We're going to talk about the first group. The first group is the Pharisees. Here's what I'd like you to remember about the Pharisees. Pharisees have complicating and corrupting hearts. In the passage, we find that Pharisees have complicating and corrupting hearts. Maybe you saw some of that. Let's explain it. You see, we have two major ways that we find collision in this story. We found the point of tension. And the two major ways are around holy habits, we could call it that, fasting. What are the right habits you should have? How do you fast? And the other one, we could just call it holy days or Sabbath. And the Pharisees are very, very concerned about these two things, fasting and Sabbath, holy habits, holy days. Now, for us to understand, first of all, that the Pharisees complicate and corrupt holy habits like fasting, we need to understand what was the original purpose for fasting. Would you agree? We can't understand how they complicated it if we don't understand what was the original command. We can't understand how their hearts twisted it if we don't understand what was God's original command. If you went to Leviticus chapter 16, verse 29 through 31, you would find the single Old Testament command towards fasting. Now, we see lots of examples of fasting in the Old Testament, but this is the command from God towards fasting. This is actually connected to the most special Jewish holiday. How many of you think you know the most special Jewish holiday? I'm not going to give you the answer yet. You don't have to raise your hand. It's okay. But if you're not raising your hand, engage in your mind. What is the most special Jewish holiday? And it's actually one called Yom Kippur. It's the Day of Atonement. And that holiday happened only once a year. And at that time, they were actually called to fast. Why did they fast? Well, they fast for three reasons. Let me give them to you. The three reasons they fast. First of all, they were supposed to fast because of their dissatisfaction with their current broken condition. So they're fasting because they're dissatisfied with their current condition. They're supposed to mourn or grieve over sin. And the third is they're supposed to anticipate the promised Messiah. That's why God gave fasting on the Day of Atonement. But how did the Pharisees complicate this expectation from God? Well, it's easy for us to complicate things. Sometimes we see even almost imperceptible gradual shifts towards something new. We know what that's like. Here's what happened. Think with me. They were commanded to fast, and then over time, they really saw this as a way to get God's attention. Fasting and prayer was, we need God's attention. But you know what happened in the story of Israel, in the history? They had ups and downs, and then at one point, they faced exile from their own homeland. They're overtaken by a foreign government, and they leave. Finally, after many years, they're able to return. But they really think that we need God's attention. And they really think, if we left because we were sinners, now we really, really must work hard to do exactly what God tells us to do. So we better start fasting. They had already lost their land, they had lost their temple, and they had lost the prestige as a nation. And now that they're back, they are really working hard to preserve the restored nation. And so what they do is they have tight explanations of God's law and tight expectations for how they were going to fulfill their interpretation of God's law. They started to add their interpretation. Do you know what fasting did? It moved from 1 time a year to 2 times a week. Pharisees were fasting on Mondays and Thursdays. Now, let me ask you this question. Is fasting 2 times a week sinful? No. Fasting 2 times a week is not sinful at all. Good, I heard someone say no. I'm glad it's not sinful. Was it what God commanded? No. So what was sinful was not the fact that they started fasting 2 times a week. What was sinful was their heart and what it actually did in connection with these holy habits. We find in passages like this, the Pharisees have complicated the fasting, and now they're doing it twice a week. And they look at everyone else and they're like, well, why aren't you as holy as me? And they're looking down on others. And they're judgmental, and they're superior, and they're sinful. We find it in the story in Luke 18. Maybe you remember this one. Jesus gives the example of 2 people go up into the temple to pray. Do you remember that? 2 people go up into the temple to pray. One is a sinner, the other is a Pharisee. And do you know how the Pharisee prays? God, I thank you so much that I'm not like other people. I give, and I fast 2 times a week. And all of a sudden, fasting is no longer about concern for the state of their nation and concerned about their sin and grieving over it and looking forward to a Messiah. Now it is about something where you can observe everybody else. You can rank and stack, and you can understand where you stand, and you can be judgmental, superior, and sinful towards everyone else. Pharisees have a complicating and corrupting heart. It was a means of religious superiority. They wanted people's attention and people's respect. In essence, they're saying, look at me and how good I am at being spiritual. The Pharisees have complicating and corrupting hearts connected to the fasting, but also with Sabbath. Let's do the same thing. Let's kind of understand what God commanded on Sabbath, and then understand how they complicated it, and then understand how they corrupted it. What did God command? Well, you could go to 2 spots in the Old Testament, and you could understand from those 2 spots about God's command for Sabbath. You go to Exodus 20, which is the giving of the 10 commandments, and then you could go to Deuteronomy chapter 5, which is where Moses retells the 10 commandments as they're getting ready to go into the promised land. And in these 2 passages, we find there are 2 clear reasons why God gave his people the Sabbath. One was to reflect God's own pattern at creation of work and then rest. God didn't rest because he was tired. He's God. God rested to set a pattern for us. And then he's like, I want my people to follow that exact same pattern as well. Work and rest. And the second reason why God gave his people the Sabbath, we find in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15. It makes it really clear that the reason is to remember the salvation that the Israelites had by God's hand from Egypt. Sabbath is designed to remember God's salvation. Think about it. Sabbath rest was a way for the Israelites to both celebrate and reprogram. They had been slaves for 400 years in Egypt. You don't get a day off when you're a slave. And now God had delivered them. And this Sabbath, this one day of rest, was to help them rejoice, celebrate, and reprogram. In essence, God is saying, you don't need to slave away every day like you used to under your old oppressive slave owners. You are free, and here is a gift. It's rest. That's what God was doing with the Sabbath. Well, Pharisees love to complicate and corrupt. How did they complicate it? Well, if we need to rest and we shouldn't work, we better really understand what work is. And that's what they did. So they tried to understand work, and they came up with 39 categories of work that you can't do on the Sabbath. Doesn't that sound a little complicated? Great, here's a gift. Now here are the 39 ways in which you need to and cannot use this gift from God. They're complicating it. But not only did they give 39 reasons, it was like a nested list. If you guys are into nested lists, it's like they were getting things done with the Sabbath. They had a high-level list and 39 of those, and then they had subcategories of what you do and what you don't do and how you do it, all about the Sabbath. And so they're now complicating and twisting the intent of this day. It became a way for the Israelites to think they could earn God's approval. As we talk about complicating it, I think it'd be interesting and kind of instructive if I gave you some examples of how they complicate it. Okay, you ready? Here's some ways. So, if we're supposed to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, if you're not supposed to work, it might actually be important to know what is work. And they said, well, tying a knot could be work. So they said, you better know how to tie the right knot. Do you know what there was a distinction between good knots and bad knots for Sabbath day? The distinction was, if you can untie the knot with one hand, that's a good knot. If you can untie the knot with two hands, nope. 2 hands, that's work. Can't do that on the Sabbath day. So you better think through what type of knots are you tying, because can you untie it? And if you tie the wrong knot, you have worked. They're complicating the Sabbath. Let me give you another one. If you're not supposed to work, then you really shouldn't, their interpretation was, you shouldn't carry a burden. Let me ask you this question. How heavy is a burden? You ever wonder that? How heavy is too heavy? Well, the answer that they gave was, it could not be over the weight of a dried fig. I don't know how heavy a dried fig is, but that is not heavy at all, is it? Do you see how they're complicating it? They feel that if they regulate it down to the number of grams or ounces or what's going on, they can say, oh, you've crossed the line and now you're working. They actually would talk about half dried fig weights, and you could carry 1 half dried fig weight here and then another half dried fig weight and then another half. It got complicated and confusing. Talked about other things too. I thought this one was hilarious. You could take a radish if you like radishes. Any radish lovers? Okay, good. A couple, you like it? Well, you guys can enjoy your radish. If you want a little seasoning on it, great. You can dip it into the salt, but be careful. Because one dip is okay. But if you leave the radish in too long, you're actually starting to pickle the radish, and that's considered work because you're pickling the radish. Do you see how this became so complicated? You couldn't climb a tree, ride, swim, clap your hands, strike your side, or dance. And what we find is that Pharisee hearts love to complicate, but they also love to corrupt. You know, as we think about this, the Pharisees had sinful hearts related to the Sabbath. They actually were accusing Jesus and his disciples of work because they did this. They're walking through the fields, which was allowed by Deuteronomy 22. Walk through the fields, pluck the grain. It's great. Deuteronomy 22 specifically allows it. But the Pharisees said, no. When you plucked that grain off of the wheat, that is harvesting. When you rubbed it between your hands, that's threshing. When you ate it, that's actually preparing a meal. Wow, they're really getting complicated. And now they have corrupted hearts that are being shown in this way. But it doesn't stop with Jesus and his disciples. Do you know what the Pharisees thought about the hungry on the Sabbath? Just wait. You can't eat. If you're hungry, you starve. What do they think about the hurting and sick? Unless you are literally dying, you could not get any help on the Sabbath. Their corrupting heart was on display. And even here in this passage, we find that the broken and the needy are merely pawns for religious arguments and religious attacks against Jesus. Pharisees have complicating and corrupting hearts. The Pharisees scrutinized fasting and harvesting and working, and they missed all of it because they thought that God was going to accept them based on their perfect keeping of their own commands. So what started out as a desire to follow God's commands has now become an obsessive, oppressive, self-produced self-righteousness. Let me read you what one author wrote. I think this is helpful to understand. One author said this: "The challenge of the Pharisees is revealing. They accused Jesus of doing what was unlawful, that is, contrary to God's law as given through Moses. But there was no scriptural law against what he and his disciples did. The Pharisees could no longer distinguish between their own man-made interpretations and traditions and the God-given law." Do you know what? As I considered this passage, I understand that it's not just the Pharisees who are like this. I'm like this. We are all like this. Humans have the ability to legislate obedience to God, to twist it in self-serving ways, and then to puff ourselves up and feel superior over others. We have Pharisee hearts. We have legalistic lives. Let me ask you the question: where do you gravitate towards judgmentalism, superiority, and sin? Where does your own heart gravitate towards judgmentalism, superiority, and sin? Let me give you a couple categories that might help us to think about this. Are you, like the Pharisees, judgmental, filled with superiority and sin in regards to religion? Are you fixated on external expectations of your own creation? Maybe it looks more like these arbitrary standards that really look most like your own cultural preferences or immediate context. Maybe your judgmentalism, superiority, and sin is more on display where you put most of your effort. Maybe that's with a job or with education. Is that where you're judgmental, superior, and displaying sin? Maybe your own heart has hijacked a good work ethic, but it has made you a workaholic or an education-aholic or a perfectionaholic. Now, I know all of you perfectionists just had a real problem with that last one. You're like, it's not a perfectionaholic, it's a perfectionist. You proved my point. So, I do the same thing. Because we can be so judgmental, superior, and sinful. Maybe it's with parenting. Think how easy it is to draw the lines in the sand and then to judge other people based on where we drew those lines. It can cover everything from home birth versus hospital birth, or the different schooling options or choices. This is the right line. No, that's the right line. And we all of a sudden are judgmental, superior, and even sinful towards one another. Maybe it's some families are like, oh, we're a sports family. And another family's like, no, we're a STEM family. Science, technology, engineering, and math. No. And all of a sudden we have these lines that are being drawn, and superiority is on display. Screen time versus book time. How to correct your children. How to feed your children. We could go on and on and on. And all it shows is that all of us have Pharisee hearts and legalistic lives. We do the exact same thing. Maybe it's not any of those, but for you, it's your cause. It's an organization, a charity, a burden, or a cause. It's moved from, well, this is really what I should do, to this is what everyone else should do, and if you don't do this, you've crossed the line. Because we are so good at drawing lines, judging ourselves and others based on those lines, and feeling superior. We become the person who's wide-eyed with bulging neck veins screaming, "You crossed the line!" without ever stopping to think, what line? Is that the right line? Is that God's line? So let me ask you a few questions. Could it be that God wanted you to encounter this passage about dogmatic Pharisees and judgmental scribes so you could see yourself? Is God calling you to confess a self-righteous heart, a judgmental stance towards others, or an attitude of perfectionism? Where is the Spirit at work? Is it possible that you can look at the most sincere followers of Christ, still find fault in them, and mutter belittling things about them under your breath in this very building? Or maybe it's not here, but it's at home. It's no better. Can we even spiritually be judgmental, spiritual, and sinful? Does your Pharisee heart sow seeds of discord in the church, in community group, or in your own family? And what we should learn from here is we need to confess that. We need to root out the heart that wants to complicate and corrupt God's command. We found here, Pharisees and us have complicating and corrupting hearts. But that's not the only heart that is on display in the passage. Let me show you another heart. Pharisees have complicating and corrupting hearts, but Jesus has a very different heart indeed. Did you catch it? Jesus has a compassionate heart. Jesus has a deep heart of compassion. Sorry. It's an entirely different heart altogether. And as we look at this passage, we see two things. The first is Jesus' compassionate heart seeks to remind. He seeks to actually help these people remember what God really intended. I'm going to give you 7 things that Jesus wanted to remind them. Okay? You don't need to write them down. You can. You don't need to track all of them. But just so you know, there's 7. It'll feel a little bit long, but don't get lost in the weeds. Here's what Jesus is doing in this passage. He's saying, you are so far from what my Father told you. Your broken lives have twisted everything, but I want to bring you back to what God really said. I'm going to remind you. Here's the first one. Jesus said, I want to remind you of the real reason to fast. Remember? It's to show dissatisfaction of sin. It's to grieve over sin, and it's to anticipate the coming Messiah. I want you to remember that God said he would hear you. God said he would respond. And now is not the time to fast, but rather it's a time to celebrate because God has done exactly what he said he would do. And the one that you are fasting for is standing in front of you. Jesus compassionately wants to remind them. He wants to remind them of the groom promises. Now, as we read this, we read the word bridegroom. We don't use that word. But that actually spoke very differently to the people who were listening because they understood the different groom promises in the Old Testament. Passages like Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel and Hosea. God said he was going to show up himself and he was going to love his people like a groom adores his bride on the wedding day. Their anticipation and hope would finally be over. God would be there and he would display everlasting love and compassion on his people. And in reminding them of that, Jesus is saying, I am the groom, and I am here, God on display. Jesus wanted to remind them that the Jews had tried for thousands of years to follow God. They had had ups, they had had downs, they had had success, they had had failure, they had had national moments of significance, and they had had national shame. And no matter how hard they tried, they could not work hard enough. And their efforts and religious attempts were not working. They were actually counterproductive to what they really wanted. They didn't need to keep tweaking things. They didn't need to keep adding things. They needed something entirely new. Jesus is reminding them, your efforts have not worked. You need something new. Something so new that it's incompatible with your current system. It's as incompatible as taking a brand new shirt, ripping off a sleeve, and sticking it on an old, worn-out garment and hoping it fixes it. It won't. You just destroyed it. That's incompatible. It was as incompatible as taking new wine and putting it in an old container, knowing it's just going to spill and you're going to waste it. Jesus is saying you need something entirely new. Stop insisting on your broken preferences for what is familiar and for what is comfortable. What you need is me. That's what Jesus is saying. What you need is me, and I am here. Jesus wanted to remind them that the Sabbath is a gift. He talks about David here. And the story with David actually is supposed to point them back to 1 Samuel, where David is on the run and he talks to Ahimelech the priest. And what we know from the Old Testament and even what Jesus says, David, it would have been wrong for him to go and take the bread of the presence for his own self. That would have been wrong because that bread was a gift from God to his priests. But it wasn't wrong for Ahimelech the priest to take God's gift that he had received and to graciously, mercifully give it to someone who was starving. Because that's the heart of God, gracious and merciful. And Jesus is trying to remind them, you misunderstand the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a gift from God. See the love, mercy, and grace of God. I want to remind you that the Sabbath is a gift. We see the phrase here, Son of Man, in Luke chapter 6, verse 5. And in that, Jesus wanted to remind these people of Daniel chapter 7, verse 13 and 14. Because there, the Son of Man is described. And who is that Son of Man who is described in Daniel 7? Well, it's God Almighty. It's the everlasting King, because he's the everlasting God. And what Jesus is saying is, I am the Son of Man. I am God in flesh right here in front of you. Don't miss it. Jesus wanted to remind them that the Sabbath is for doing good. Did you catch that last phrase or the last story? He asked them the question, is it good and lawful on the Sabbath? Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy? I think Jesus might have been echoing what is said in Proverbs chapter 3. Listen to this. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to do it. Do not say to your neighbor, go and come again tomorrow, I'll give it, when you have it with you. Do not plan evil against your neighbor who dwells trustingly beside you. Jesus is saying, if I don't do good for this person in need right now, when it's in my power to do it, when it's in my power to heal, then I am doing evil. And what's the Sabbath all about? Is it about doing good or doing evil? The last thing Jesus wanted to remind them, you are looking for Messiah. Every hope, every dream that you have is wrapped up in that one person. I am He. I am here. That's what Jesus was saying. Can I read you an extended quote from a commentary? It's a little longer. I just want to warn you, but I think it's super helpful. I think it'll help us with this spot. One of the authors wrote this: Jesus, as the Messiah, came to establish a completely new paradigm, a new world order instituted and implemented by the Creator in human form. The religious elite should not have been taken unaware. Prophets had long foretold the coming of a new way that would replace the old, and that this new way would involve God himself pursuing the unrighteous to bring them to repentance and to restore their broken fellowship with him. Instead of summoning the unrighteous to the temple, Jesus would seek them where they are and save them as they are. Unfortunately, this new way would not sit well with the old guard. But if they thought Jesus partying with sinners rubbed them the wrong way, they hadn't seen anything yet. I thought that was helpful because it really shows Jesus' compassionate heart to remind. The Pharisees completely missed it. And Jesus didn't stop at just having a compassionate heart with a desire to remind. Jesus had a compassionate heart that sought to redeem. This is a critical point. It is not enough that the people just remember what God had commanded them initially. They were supposed to be a unique people to display God's glory, but without a new heart, without new desires, they were going to do exactly what they had already done. All of their disciplines are only going to result in more self-righteousness that made them further from God and further from man. They don't just need new information, they need a new heart. And to get a new heart, they needed a redeemer. And in each of these stories, we see Jesus, the Redeemer, on display. Let me go through each of these. I think it'll be a blessing to you as much as it was to me. In the first story on fasting, this centered around the Jewish Day of Atonement. And this was the day where the Israelites, according to tradition, were concerned that God was deciding each person's fate. So Jews were encouraged to make amends and ask forgiveness for sins committed during the past year. And so this year they would make amends and they would pray and they would fast and they'd ask for God to forgive their sins and they would hope that it happened. And then next year they would pray and fast and make amends and hope it happened. And next year they would pray and fast and make amends and hope it happened. And year over year over year over year, they kept on pleading for God to hear them, forgive them, and save them. And you know what Jesus is saying? I am your day of atonement. Once for all, I will make sacrifice for your sins. I am forgiveness walking right down the street. I want to save you. I have a compassionate heart that wants to redeem. In our second story, we start talking about Sabbath rest. But Jesus says, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. And we find that he actively fulfilled all of the requirements to free humans from sin by dying on the cross. And so what we find is that just like Hebrews 4 says, Jesus is the Sabbath rest for the people of God. Jesus says, I've paid for your sin. I am your Sabbath rest. Now you can rest in me. Let me redeem you. I am the real rest you are looking for. And then in our final story, I think Jesus' compassionate heart that seeks to redeem is put on full display. You see, as Jesus is teaching here in the synagogue, everybody is noticing one person. It's the person with the withered hand, the crippled hand. And Jesus notices him too. The Greek idea here, it was pointed out, I didn't know this, so I had to read it. The Greek idea was like a dried up plant or a leaf in the middle of winter, shriveled and unused. It was his right hand. He couldn't provide for himself. He couldn't care. Some historians who write about this have said that it was even speculated that maybe he was a carpenter who experienced some work accident that tragically took away his capabilities. And now he has no way to provide. But the way most of the religious people viewed this person was irrefutable evidence that this is judgment against sin because something horrible like that happened to you. But Jesus has a compassionate heart and he wants to redeem. So what does he say? You, over there, far from me, everyone's staring, no one's caring. You, come here, stand next to me. I see you and I love you. And he has this man come stand right next to him. And do you know what I find? He heals him. But even in the act of healing, Jesus is sealing his fate even further with the Pharisees. I am going to heal you, but it will kill me in the process. Because even with this act of mercy and compassion and redemption for this poor man's arm, he's marching closer and closer, inevitably, to the cross. But that was Jesus' plan all along. It's not just the single crippled man to whom Jesus shows compassion and a desire to redeem. He looks across all time and across all nations and he says, I will take your sin sickness on myself because I'm the great physician. And I will heal you even though it kills me in the process. And Jesus' compassionate heart to redeem is on full display. Do you know what I find is incredibly sad in this passage? Here we have religious people who have studied the Word way more than you and I ever have. They've memorized books of the Torah. They know these passages. They have cried and prayed, and they have so desperately tried to the letter of the law, and even more, observe fasting and observe Sabbath. And they at some level have wanted, but they missed Jesus in the very process. Everything they wanted is right there in front of them, but they completely missed it. He's standing there, perfect forgiveness, walking down the street. This made me think of, I've got 3 boys, it made me think of different points in the younger years of my boys' lives where they'd wake up in the middle of the night with a bad dream. They're half awake, and all they are is scared and half asleep. I think we know what that's like. We've probably felt that, and maybe we've seen it with our own kids. And they lie awake in bed, and they're crying, "Dad, Dad, come help me." But they don't realize that the dad has already heard their cry. He knows they're in need. He's responded. He's right next to them saying, "I love you, I'm here." But they're half awake and not aware that their dad is present already. And I feel like that's where these Pharisees were. They had been crying and praying, but they didn't realize God himself was there. If only they would look to him and trust. Remember, God isn't present to redeem because the Israelites perfectly kept his law or perfectly kept their own interpretation of their law. God redeems because he will always keep his promises and he will ultimately rescue his people. We've seen 2 different hearts in the story. We've seen the Pharisees, we've seen Jesus. Lastly, let's see one more, okay? The last heart, it's ours. It's our heart. We can't read this story just looking at who the characters are, the beginning, the middle, and the end. We can't look at this story just understanding facts. We must engage with it ourselves. Luke was written not so we observe, but so we respond. It's designed to expose our heart and then call us to respond. So how might we respond to this story about Pharisee hearts and Jesus' heart of compassion? I think the passage shows us. So let me just help us see it, and then we'll close. The very end of our passage, we see one example. The very beginning of our passage, we see the other example. Verse 11 of chapter 6. The Pharisees were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. The one response is livid and plotting. You see, these Pharisees, they were filled with fury. We could have just said they completely lost it. They were out of their minds with rage. They had no way to contain it. They were so ticked at Jesus that they were plotting what they were going to do. But they weren't plotting how they were going to talk or how they were going to write a letter or what they might say. No, they were plotting to destroy. Mark and Matthew, 2 other Gospels who have this story, make it very clear. They had rage-filled hearts wanting to destroy Jesus. That's one potential response to the message of Jesus. But there's another, and it's the one I alluded to in my introduction. The heart of Levi. Levi, or Matthew as we call him, the tax collector. Do you know when he actually was encountered by Jesus, he responded in repentance and faith. He left everything and followed Jesus. And there was celebration and grace. These are the 2 bookends. These are the 2 options. Either sin can be forgiven and we can celebrate God's grace, like Levi, or we can be livid when our Pharisee hearts are exposed and opposed, and we can seek to disqualify a message or make ourselves still feel okay. And our Pharisee heart is still on display. God doesn't want us to have Pharisee hearts. God wants to redeem. I think about the great redemption God gave to Israel. He saved them from Egypt and he gave them a new land. But I think he wants to do something even greater in us. He saves us from sin and wants to give us a new heart. You know this problem we've been talking about the whole time? The problem of our heart? Jesus says, I want to give you a new heart. God actually says that in the Old Testament. I'm going to put a new heart in you. And Paul made it very clear in Romans. To those who are convicted of sin, confess with your mouth and believe God at his word. And for those, God's going to do a miracle. He'll forgive you and he'll put a new heart within you. So in closing, I just ask the question, how will you respond to God's word today? Here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to just pray over all of us. And then I'm going to ask a few questions, and we're just going to leave some space where you can reflect and respond, okay? So how about I pray, if you don't mind? Eli's going to start playing for us. We're going to take a season of prayer and response to what we have read. Thank you, God, for this passage, Luke chapter 6, Luke chapter 5. Thank you in all of this that you do expose hearts. Thank you for revealing your compassionate, redeeming heart, God. Thank you, though painful, thank you that you show our Pharisee-like hearts. You show how we complicate and how we corrupt. Thank you, God, that you've graciously done that. You say that your word is like a surgeon's knife that actually cuts down deep. It exposes the sin. It exposes the heart behind everything. But that's you graciously doing that. Help us, God, to respond rightly to you. I pray that by your word and through your Spirit, you have exposed hearts this morning. So now may we respond. Maybe in confession. Maybe in faith. God, I pray that you would work. As we continue on in our season of response, I'm going to ask you guys a few questions. Maybe you need to confess your judgmental view of others and your self-righteous opinion of yourself. Maybe through today, you saw the compassionate heart of Jesus. You learned that Jesus is the promised answer to your greatest problems. And I'd encourage you to pray, ask Him to redeem you even now. Maybe you are surrounded by the spiritual, but you don't see God. He is present. He is working, but you just don't see Him. Maybe your prayer needs to be that of what Eli's playing right now. Show us Christ. Give me eyes to see and ears to hear. Whatever your response needs to be, I encourage you, respond to God now.